A well-respected
The court
judge hands
finds
down
the
a
defendant
60-year
guilty
prison
as
sentence to a
charged.
young man he's convinced is guilty, but when a long-overlooked piece of evidence comes to light, it exposes a deep-rooted web of corruption that shakes the entire justice system. The courtroom in Fresno, California was packed that day. The atmosphere was tense, not just from the summer heat, but from the weight of the ruling about to be made. All attention was on Judge Malcolm Brewer, a man with a reputation that spoke for itself. Known for being strict and unsympathetic, his decisions were known to be swift, firm, and unwavering. At 62 years old and with 35 years on the bench, his expression was as hardened as his legal legacy, a reflection of the countless lives altered by his judgments. Standing at the defense table was 24-year-old Ryan Hale. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes remained steady. His face carried the look of someone who had spent a lifetime trying to be believed. From the moment of his arrest for an armed robbery that left a man in critical condition, Ryan had always claimed he was innocent. But on this day, his words wouldn't matter. Mr. Hale, Judge Brewer's deep voice echoed through the courtroom. You have been found guilty by a jury of your peers for crimes that cause irreparable harm to this community. Your actions were deliberate, dangerous, and you've shown no regret. In the back row, Ryan's mother choked back tears. She had pleaded with the court to see her son as more than a defendant, to see the boy she had raised, the one who once dreamed of becoming a firefighter. But the evidence was stacked against him. Witness testimonies, grainy security footage, and an anonymous tip that seemed to seal his fate. I hereby sentence you to 60 years in state prison, Judge Brewer concluded, bringing his gavel down on the wooden block. The sound echoed like a final judgment. Ryan didn't move. His lips formed a tight line, holding back words that wouldn't change the outcome. The courtroom stirred. Gasps, whispers, reporters scribbling notes, but for Ryan, everything faded into silence. He looked at his mother one last time as officers led him away, chains clinking with each step down the hallway. Back in his chambers, Judge Brewer closed the door behind him. He poured a cup of black coffee and stared into it, as if searching for some kind of clarity. It had been a long day, but he believed justice had been done, at least for now. What he didn't realize was that the truth he thought he'd buried was about to force its way into the light. The trial had gripped the local media. Known as the Hale robbery case, it stayed in the headlines for weeks. The crime was bold. A masked man stormed into Carter's Jewelers in downtown Fresno on a busy Thursday, waving a gun and stealing over $150,000 in merchandise. In the chaos, Clerk Samuel Gaines was shot and left in critical condition. 2 weeks later, Ryan Hale, a part-time mechanic with a clean record, was arrested after an anonymous tip suggested he matched the suspect's description. Prosecutors presented a strong case, security footage showing someone with Ryan's build, witnesses who claimed they recognized his voice, and fingerprints found on the weapon left at the scene. Stolen goods were even discovered in a storage unit registered to his name. Ryan's court-appointed lawyer struggled against the flood of evidence. Ryan took the stand, declaring, "I didn't do this. I wasn't near that store. I've never even held a gun." He said he had been working a double shift at the auto shop during the robbery, but under oath, his boss admitted he couldn't confirm Ryan's location for the entire day. In contrast to Ryan's weak defense, the prosecution was relentless. This man thought he could cheat the law, the district attorney said to the jury. But facts don't lie. Fingerprints don't lie. Witnesses don't lie. Ryan's lawyer made a final plea. There are gaps in this case. Uncertainty. Isn't that enough to give this young man a chance? But his argument lacked strength. The jury took less than 3 hours to deliver their verdict, guilty on all charges. Ryan showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but the clenched jaw hinted at the storm inside him. Judge Brewer, calm and composed, prepared to deliver the sentence he felt was right. To him, Ryan was no different than any other criminal who tried to game the system. He scanned the courtroom for even a flicker of remorse. There was none. As the sentence was announced, the room seemed to collectively exhale. Relief for the victims, despair for Ryan and his mother. The justice system had spoken, and it was merciless. That evening, as Judge Brewer signed the official paperwork, something gnawed at him, a vague sense of unease. He shrugged it off, blaming exhaustion. What he didn't know was that the real story hadn't even started. It began on an ordinary Wednesday night. Judge Brewer sat in his study, lit by a desk lamp that cast soft light over. scattered files and legal briefs. He'd been thinking about retirement, but tonight he was focused on a new case involving allegations of police misconduct. As he flipped through the documents, one file caught his eye, an evidence log from a previous investigation. At first, it seemed trivial. Amid the mountain of files, what first appeared to be a trivial detail suddenly caught Judge Brewer's eye, a name, Ryan Hale. He leaned back in his chair, brows furrowed. It wasn't unusual for a familiar name to pop up in unrelated cases, but this felt different. His curiosity piqued. Brewer flipped a page. His heartbeat quickened. The document was an inventory list from a police evidence locker tied to a different robbery case, one that had occurred around the same time as the Carter's Jewelers incident. One item stood out, a firearm whose description closely resembled the weapon used in the robbery that had led to Ryan's conviction. But there was a problem. This gun had never been submitted into evidence during Ryan's trial. In fact, it hadn't been mentioned at all. Brewer leaned forward, a heaviness settling over him. He cross-checked the weapon's serial number with details from Ryan's case, still vivid in his mind. It was an exact match. Same model. Same identifying marks on the barrel. But according to the report, this gun had been confiscated during an unrelated arrest 2 days after the Carter's heist. How can that be? He murmured, tension building in his chest. If the weapon had already been in police custody shortly after the crime, it couldn't have been used in the robbery. And if it wasn't a weapon, then whose fingerprints were actually found on it? Something didn't add up. Judge Brewer had spent decades navigating the maze of the legal system. He knew that key deals could sometimes get lost, but this wasn't oversight. It felt deliberate. Determined to uncover the truth, he requested the complete case file for the other robbery. The documents arrived the next morning, a thick folder full of police reports, photos, and witness accounts. As Brewer read through them, the pieces began to shift, forming a disturbing picture. The officer who handled the arrest in the unrelated case, the same detective who had testified at Ryan's trial. And then there was the anonymous tip that led to Ryan's arrest. Brewer hadn't questioned it much during the original trial, but now it felt suspicious. He filed a subpoena for the phone records from the police tip line. The more time passed, the more anxious he became. When the records finally arrived, a chill ran down his spine. The call had not come from a concerned citizen. It was traced back to a burner phone linked to Detective Lewis, the very officer who had led the investigation against Ryan. The walls seemed to press in around Brewer as the truth hit him. Ryan Hale had been framed. The evidence had been tampered with. The testimonies manipulated. Brewer's stomach twisted as he thought about the 60-year sentence he had handed down. The life of a young man, possibly innocent, shattered by lies. He had always believed in upholding the law. But now it felt like the law had betrayed him. And despite the dangers, Brewer knew he had to pursue the truth. He couldn't let this go. From that moment on, Brewer barely slept. His days were spent buried in case files, his nights filled with frantic scribbles and notes. The deeper he dug, the darker the truth became. The first major crack appeared during a quiet meeting at a roadside diner on Highway 99. Brewer sat across from retired investigator Daniel Hayes, a man known for sniffing out corruption. Brewer laid everything out. Hayes sipped his coffee, eyes narrowing. "This isn't sloppy police work," he said flatly. "This is calculated. Someone wanted that kid behind bars, no matter what." "I need solid proof, Dan," Brewer replied grimly. Hayes agreed to help. Soon the two of them were buried in police files, statements, and internal documents. What they found was shocking. Fabricated reports and missing evidence records and witness statements clearly altered to fit the prosecution's version of events. One witness stood out, a store clerk who had first identified someone else as the suspect but later changed his statement to blame Ryan. Hayes tracked the man to a run-down apartment on the city's edge. When questioned, the man broke. "I didn't want to lie," he confessed, visibly shaken. "But Detective Lewis, he threatened me. Said if I didn't say what he wanted, I'd be charged with obstruction. I was scared." The name, Detective Lewis, sparked fury in Brewer, the same officer responsible for the phony tip and missing evidence. As they continued investigating, a pattern emerged. Lewis had a long record of shady tactics, intimidating witnesses, fabricating evidence, and forcing confessions. Yet his personnel file was spotless, protected by layers of bureaucracy. The breakthrough came when Hayes managed to recover deleted emails from Lewis' police account. One message in particular stood out. It was addressed to the district attorney and outlined a plan to guarantee a conviction in Carter's robbery case. Attached were forged documents and altered witness statements. Brewer's pulse pounded as he read. The justice system he had dedicated his life to had been corrupted from the inside. But there was no time for self-pity. He finally had the proof, and he had to act. It wouldn't be easy. Lewis had friends in high places, and exposing him could destroy Brewer's career, his reputation, even endanger his life. But then he pictured Ryan, locked away for a crime he likely didn't commit. The path was clear. We go public, Brewer told Hayes one evening as they reviewed the evidence. Whatever it takes. The very next day, Judge Brewer filed a motion to reopen Ryan Hale's case, attaching every shred of damning proof. The motion shook the courthouse. But Brewer didn't stop there. He filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, calling for an independent investigation into both Detective Lewis and the Fresno Police Department. The retaliation was immediate. Anonymous threats. Cold shoulders from colleagues. Media speculation questioning his integrity. But Brewer didn't back down. The truth was finally out, and there was no turning back. While combing through a mountain of documents, what initially seemed like a meaningless detail suddenly caught Judge Brewer's attention. A name, Ryan Hale. He leaned back in his chair, eyebrows drawn together. It wasn't uncommon for familiar names to appear across unrelated cases, but this instance felt different. His curiosity sparked. Brewer turned the page. His pulse began to race. The paperwork was a catalog of evidence stored in a police facility, connected to another robbery investigation that had occurred around the same time as the Carter's Jewelers heist. One particular item stood out, a firearm whose description closely aligned with the gun used in the case that sent Ryan to prison. But something was off. This weapon had never been entered as evidence during Ryan's trial. In fact, it hadn't even been mentioned. Brewer leaned closer, the weight of the discovery starting to settle in. He checked the serial number and compared it with the information from Ryan's trial, still fresh in his memory. The match was undeniable, same model, same scuff marks on the barrel. But the report said the weapon had been seized in a completely different arrest 2 days after the Carter's robbery. How is that even possible? He whispered, tension knotting in his chest. If the gun had already been in law enforcement's possession days after the crime, it couldn't have been used in the robbery. And if this wasn't the weapon, then whose fingerprints have been presented as evidence? It didn't make sense. Brewer, with decades of courtroom experience, knew small errors happened. But this? This didn't seem like an oversight. It felt intentional. Driven to find the truth, he immediately ordered the full case file for the unrelated robbery. The next morning, a thick folder arrived, crammed with police logs, images, and testimonies. As Brewer sifted through the material, a troubling picture began to form. The arresting officer in that other case? None other than the same detective who had been a key witness in Ryan's trial. Then there was the anonymous tip that had led to Ryan's arrest. At the time, Brewer hadn't thought much of it, but now it raised red flags. He requested the call records from the police tip line. The wait for the documents was agonizing. When they arrived, they delivered a blow he wasn't ready for. The call hadn't come from a member of the public. It had come from a burner phone, registered to none other than Detective Lewis, the lead officer in Ryan's investigation. The realization hit Brewer like a ton of bricks. Ryan Hale had been framed. The case had been manipulated. The evidence falsified. Witnesses likely pressured. Brewer's stomach turned as he remembered the 60-year sentence he had personally handed down. A young man's entire future, quite possibly destroyed by corruption. Brewer had always taken pride in his commitment to the law. But now, the very foundation he believed in seemed tainted. Despite the danger, he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore this. From that night on, Brewer barely slept. He spent his days poring over case files and his nights filling notebooks with frantic notes and leads. The deeper he went, the more twisted the story became. The first major lead came during a quiet meeting at a small diner off Highway 99. Across the table sat Daniel Hayes, a retired investigator known for rooting out corruption. Brewer laid out everything he'd found. Hayes listened closely, setting his mug aside. This wasn't incompetence, he said plainly. Someone made sure that kid went down for a crime he didn't commit. I need hard evidence, Dan, Brewer said, his tone grim. Hayes agreed to help. Together, they dove into old case records, transcripts, and internal communications. What they discovered was damning. Police reports altered, critical documents missing, and witness statements rewritten to fit the prosecution's version of events. One detail stood out. A store employee had initially identified a different suspect, but later changed his statement to point to Ryan. Hayes found the man living quietly in a run-down apartment at the edge of town. When confronted, the man broke down. I didn't want to lie, he admitted, voice shaking. But Detective Lewis threatened me. Said if I didn't go along, I'd be charged with obstruction. What was I supposed to do? The mention of Lewis made Brewer's blood boil. The same detective who planted the fake tip, the one who kept key evidence hidden. As their probe continued, a disturbing pattern emerged. Louis had a long history of using aggressive and unethical tactics, coercing witnesses, forging evidence, and forcing confessions. Yet his record was squeaky clean, protected by the very system he worked within. Then came the smoking gun. Hayes recovered deleted emails from Lewis's police email account. One message stood out. Addressed to the district attorney, laid out a strategy to secure conviction in the Carter's robbery case. Attached were forged pieces of evidence and revised witness statements. Brewer's pulse pounded as he read the email. The legal system he had devoted his life to corrupted from within. But this wasn't the time for despair. He had the evidence. Now he had to act. He knew the risks. Lewis had powerful allies, and exposing him could cost Brewer his job, his standing, even his personal safety. But when he pictured Ryan Hale, locked in a cell for a crime he likely didn't commit, the decision became simple. We go public, Brewer told Hayes one evening, reviewing the files. No matter what it takes. The next morning, Judge Brewer submitted a motion to reopen Ryan Hale's case, attaching every piece of proof they had uncovered. The filing sent shockwaves through the legal community. But Brewer wasn't finished. He also filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, calling for an independent investigation into Detective Lewis in the Fresno Police Department. The pushback was swift. He received anonymous threats. Colleagues avoided him. News outlets questioned his motives. Still, Brewer stood firm. The truth was out, and there would be no turning back.